I'm here on the line with Nicole Foss, economist and futurist, live from New Zealand. How are you doing, Nicole?
I am doing very well, thank you. We're on lockdown. This is day 10, and we've got, in theory, it's a 4-week lockdown, so it's supposed to end the 23rd of April. Not completely sure that it's going to do that, but we'll see where we go from here.
Gotcha. So, what have you been up to since you started hearing of this coronavirus? I mean, how has the knowledge of it and the lockdown and everything, how has that changed what you've been spending your time doing?
It really shifted my focus pretty quickly. I started following this to some extent around New Year's and watching it in China thinking, this could be something significant. And about halfway through January, it was, okay, this is not just significant, this is enormous, and we're going to do something about this right now. So we decided to go and buy quite a bit of dried food in particular. It's a bit complicated for us, not for everybody, but for me, because there are a whole lot of things I can't eat. And those tend to be all the things that are the easiest to dry and store. So we have a whole freezer full of something called caveman candy, which is biltong. So it's dried meat and things like that. So we have a whole lot of things that involve protein wherever we could find it, and things that would last a long time. We also tried to get hold of some protective equipment. We didn't bother to try and buy medical masks because we thought, well, A, it would be difficult because they're probably already out of stock, and B, the medical people are going to need them more. So we went to the builder's market and bought builder's masks and things. So they're not perfect because they wouldn't screen out moisture particularly. They're meant for dust rather than anything moist, but they're better than nothing. I've been following Chris Martinson's videos every day for the time that he's been doing them, and I really find his work has been absolutely fascinating and invaluable. And he has all the skills to be able to interpret this data that's coming out in dribs and drabs. So he's managing to get ahead of what can be peer reviewed. So peer review takes time, obviously, but because of Chris's skills, he's able to interpret data that hasn't been through peer review in a way that makes it almost as good. And he's able to say, well, this is good data, this is not so much, we trust these numbers, we don't trust these, and try and draw the lessons out from whatever information is available. So he's made this his full-time job for the last 2.5 months. And he's put up with having his entire channel demonetized and everything as a result. People are saying, oh, this is just misinformation. It's not. It's the best information you're going to get on COVID-19. But because it's not peer reviewed, there are people who look down on it. So I've been following all of that, and it's really been fascinating. I was originally a biologist and a medical researcher before I worked on other things. So now I'm shifting back into reading all these papers on disease mechanisms and things like that, which has been fascinating. So my two focuses for the last couple of months have been the disease and how it's being handled in various parts of the world, and what lessons can be drawn from what things seem to be working, what things seem to be a particular risk. So it really has been fascinating, but I've been just obsessed, absolutely obsessed with watching it, learning from it, and then doing things ourselves. So one of the other things we did apart from food is we upgraded our computers because things were getting a bit old. We didn't upgrade everything, but a lot of these things come from China. And we were thinking, well, we might not have bought this for another year, but who knows if it'll even be possible in another year. And because we work online and technology is our key to being able to work from home, we thought this would be necessary, so we did that. We also made sure that everybody had a bicycle because New Zealand has 100% fuel import dependency.
Oh my.
So we produce about 40% of the oil that we use, but we can't refine our own oil. We produce light sweet crude, which is valuable. We export all of that, and we import heavy sour crude, which we refine. So if the import-export things don't work anymore, it's a money arbitrage situation. So we make money doing that because what we sell is more expensive than what we buy instead. But it means that we have this 100% dependency on liquid fuels. So that is potentially an issue. At the moment, it doesn't look like it's going to be an immediate issue, but we thought, well, bicycles would be useful, and they're all made in China as well. So we thought, well, I'll just get some bicycles now. So it was a bit of an expensive time to prepare, looking at all the things that were the bases we needed to cover. We had no idea how long the quarantine was going to last, because when we were doing all this, it wasn't even on the radar in this country. We didn't have any cases that we knew of for the longest time. As soon as there was one case in the country, there were queues outside the supermarkets, and everybody started hoarding toilet paper, like instantly, the very same day. And we ended up in lockdown with the first case that could not be connected to international travel. So the first case that indicated community transmission, that's when the lockdown came. We were already fully prepared by then. So we'd already done everything. We wanted to make sure that we'd done everything before there was a massive humanity in the shops and there were gaps and things, because that would have been absolutely awful. And by doing that, we also leave plenty of things for other people who didn't manage to prepare in time. So we're not competing with them for whatever's left in the shops. And we haven't tried to go shopping since the lockdown. We have not set foot out of the house in 10 days. And we can probably manage to continue not to do that for at least another month. But we'll see. We're already on the powdered milk and things like that. But the kids aren't complaining too much so far. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, that's a different experience from here. We've been in the house for 30 days after we returned from a trip to Italy, and
Ooh.
maybe it's longer, 31 days now. I'm not sure, but we have, after the first 14 days, we did start going out sparingly. So I have been to the grocery store 3 times and to the service station, but I've been keeping my like 6 feet, at least 6 social distance. And I know that might not necessarily be enough because people can breathe on each other, but my perspective is that if this is a virus that's going to make me sick, it's probably not going to make me so sick that I'm going to need to go to the hospital. And
yeah, well, the thing is, it reduces the viral load. Even if it wouldn't stop you catching it, you would catch a smaller dose of it that would give your body a chance to get ahead of it.
Right.
So it's still a good idea. It's probably not enough to reduce the risk to 0, but because it can be aerosolized as well. But it's better than nothing, definitely. I'm thinking of making some masks. I have some seamstress skills as well, so I'm thinking I might just spend some time doing that.
Yes, my wife made 3 masks today. And I made one last week. I'll show you. It's not wonderful, but I made this one last week.
That looks pretty good to me.
This is based on the design that the local hospital said this is how it's meant to be made. It took me a long time to make.
Yeah, the ones with the folds take a lot longer. They're fiddlier.
Well, it also has the bent...
The pocket with the filter stuff?
Well, it has the pocket, but then it also has the little piece of metal to go over the nose bridge.
Yes, over the nose.
And then the elastic goes through this little sleeve, which has to be put on separately. So it took me a little time. My wife was able to make it pretty quickly, but I also have just some bandanas. And I noticed on YouTube today that there's a way to make these. If you just fold them.
I saw that with 2 hair ties, hair ties and bandana. It looked really useful.
Yeah, you just fold it twice. You put hair ties here and here, and then you fold it in, and then you basically put the hair ties like that. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, I saw that today. Hey, I was going to ask, so the last time we spoke with one another, I think you were in Michigan doing a talk, and so at that time,
2013, I believe that was.
Well, and I think at that time we were talking about how the economy was struggling and things might go south and there might be a debt deflation or there might be a hyperinflation. And we were talking about all sorts of things that people could do to prepare individually or whatever. And I'm wondering, how has your thinking changed since then? Because at that time, I was kind of thinking things were more kind of imminent, not waiting until 2020, but things were going to happen, like in 2013 or 2012 or something. So, how has your thinking changed since then? What improvements, or what have you learned since then?
Just how much pension money there was to steal before everything hit the fan.
Oh,
So there were quite a significant number of pots of money sitting around with people's names on them that, in theory, still have people's names on them, but in practice no longer exist. So the whole system has basically been plundered in the meantime, and there's been an enormous amount of credit creation along with that. So they did manage to kick the can down the road further than I thought they would have been able to do. But the problem with having done that, of course, is it just means that everything is going to be that much worse. And this virus seems to be the pin that has pricked the everything bubble that's been brewing for a very long time. So the bubble is not a short-term thing. The bubble's been brewing since at least the early 1980s with the beginning of globalization. But what seems to have happened now is that this has given it such an enormous kick, this virus has given it such an enormous kick, that everything is bursting in amazingly short times. I mean, the unemployment claims, I think, went up by 10 million in a matter of 2 weeks in the States. And there are some really interesting graphs going around looking at the history of unemployment numbers. And the spike that's happened recently is absolutely unprecedented. And I don't think people really understand what the impact of that is going to be. So it's going to be very much the things I was talking about in 2013, because this is going to be a debt deflation, and it's going to play out pretty much exactly the way I thought, but it's playing out later. So there was a lot of money floating around that could be consumed and things. So more seed corn that we could eat in the meantime to keep the system going for a while. But we've done that now. And already, before this virus really came out, the Fed was having to prop up the markets to the tune of trillions of dollars. So we were on the verge of this happening anyway, even without the virus. If you look at the repo operations that had been going on by the Fed, they were crazy. The amount of money that was having to be pumped into the system. And now the Fed is looking at buying all kinds of things, and maybe even buying stocks, just desperately trying to prop everything up. But this is really the end game. And when you get that desperate, there's really nowhere else to go. And that is going to be their problem, that not only do they not have any more ammunition, because interest rates are already essentially at zero, and not only do they not have more ammunition, but everything is getting dramatically worse in an incredibly short time frame. And people used to say to me, well, you sometimes sound kind of apocalyptic when you talk about what deflation is going to be like. And this is a problem because you're feeding the fear. And I would say, think of it as you're in a canoe upriver from Niagara Falls. You know the falls are out there somewhere, but you don't know exactly where. You start to hear white water. What are you going to do? Are you going to just keep going? Or are you going to pull over to the side of the river and maybe wander a bit down the bank and have a look and see what might be ahead? So when you go over the falls, so to speak, financially, it can happen incredibly quickly. So you can't afford to be late. You have to do it early. And there's always this dance. I mean, you can't warn too early, because if nobody has any hint that there might be anything to be concerned about, everyone will think you're a lunatic and no one will listen. If you wait till it's too late, then people might listen to what you're saying, but they don't have time to do anything about it. So it's a bit of a waste of everybody's time. You just frighten them for nothing. So you try and find a space in between there where you have to be early enough to be useful and late enough to be credible. And it's a bit of a dance. It isn't obvious where that point would lie. So all you can really do is look at the fluctuations of risk, the risk on, risk off trades and things, and say, this is a high risk junction, this is not. And when you see a high risk junction come up, then you start warning about, if this continues, this is where it's going to go. And in this particular instance, it didn't go in that full direction as quickly as I would have thought it would. They managed to find a whole lot more money to steal. They managed to invent a whole lot more credit. So it's taken longer. But now we've seemed to have got to that point, and it's unraveling incredibly quickly. I don't think we've really seen the impact yet. We're starting to see the charts and things, but because finance is virtual and it doesn't have an instant direct effect on most people's lives, they won't notice until that feeds into the real economy, which it absolutely will. Because the problem is finance being virtual has a very short time constant for change. Things can change incredibly quickly in finance in almost a blink of an eye. The real economy doesn't change that quickly because that's where you've got real people and goods and services involved, and supply chains and inertia and momentum and all these things that are going on in the real world that just make the time constant for change that much longer. But finance is a leading indicator. So what's happening in the world of finance, as dramatic as it is going to feed into the real economy. I don't think the various kinds of leadership, not in every country perhaps, but in quite a few countries, I don't think the leadership has the faintest idea what's about to happen with an enormous percentage of the population suddenly being unemployed, being incredibly dependent on inflows of money. People live paycheck to paycheck. Especially in the US, a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck, or they're already on some kind of benefit of SNAP and things like that. All of these benefits have been cut down to the absolute bare minimum for a long time. People just do not have the capacity to go even a week without being in trouble. A lot of people, anyway. And we're looking at a stimulus package in the US that isn't going to pay out for months. And even when it does, it might give people a week's worth of salary if they've had to wait for 4 months to get it. By then, if their landlords are not happy with them, they'll be out on the street, or their bank will have foreclosed on them, or something like that. And I find, looking at the way this is working out in the US, there's an enormous stimulus package. The vast majority of that is destined for the large corporates. And they are going to be given money almost instantly with almost no strings attached, almost no oversight of any kind. Everything that's destined for small businesses or individuals has strings everywhere you look. There's red tape everywhere. There are going to be huge delays. It's very complex. People have no idea how to navigate it. So they're going to be putting enormous amounts of effort into just trying to get the paltry sum that they're being offered. Other countries are offering $2,000 a month, for instance, sort of a form of UBI to say it might not be as much as you were earning, but this is something, and this will hopefully tide you over until we release the lockdowns, and then you can go back to work. Or they're giving money to companies to say, you need to keep these people on. We will cover 80% of their salary if you promise to keep these people on. And so in other countries, companies are doing that. They're not immediately laying people off. Whether that means the same number of jobs will still be available at the end of the day is not so clear, because that all depends on supply chains. And there's so many unknowns, so many factors that are going to be black swans in this. And my friend David Korovitz wrote a superb paper called Trade-Off some years ago. It was about exactly this scenario. It was about a pandemic creating a collapse of supply chains. And it was absolutely brilliant. So I would really recommend that if people want to look at all the complex issues to do with supply chain collapse. So we don't know if all the jobs will come back, but hopefully they will, or at least a reasonable number in places where people haven't immediately been put into a situation of having absolutely nothing. But my concern in a lot of places, the US is probably the most in that direction among developed countries, but of course developing countries are in the same position. There's people are going to hit the wall extremely quickly, and there really isn't going to be any backup. I mean, in the US, this is going to be almost as if it was a developing country because of the terrible situation with healthcare there. I mean, 10 million people could have just lost their healthcare in the last 2 weeks because it's tied to employment. And there were an awful lot of people who didn't have any healthcare in the first place. And there's been no reopening of the markets for health insurance. So people who don't have it now are not able to find themselves an alternative. And these things are unfolding very quickly. How long does it take for people to be hungry before you have a revolution? Is the way people need to start thinking, I think. And how many people can go for 30 days without any food and not feel that they really just have to pick up a pitchfork because they have no other choice? So I'm really concerned about how the politics of this will play out. And I'm concerned in particular about the American South, where there's a lot more poverty, a lot more comorbidity, which increases the risk. And people tend not to believe that this is even an issue. So they're going out and participating in all manner of social activities, the same as they always do. And they just don't seem to think it's going to affect them. My concern is what's likely to happen as a result is they're going to end up being hit very hard by this. But because there's a cult of personality going on, when you have a cult of personality, people don't turn on the leader of the cult, even if they should. Leaders of cults of personality will foment that anger, and they will focus it on whoever they don't like. So the problem is that this upwelling of anger is not necessarily going to be directed at the people who caused the problems or the people who were not handling this well. It's very likely to be directed at whoever they are told is the enemy. So my concern is enormous amounts of civil unrest in the US, because so little is actually being done to make sure that people have just the very basics, just food on the table, and not being thrown out into the street by their landlords. So I think the leadership seems completely and utterly out of touch with the condition that ordinary people are living in. And the US is not the only place in the world where this is happening, but it's the most significant example that I can think of among developed countries for taking a very laissez-faire approach. Sweden is to some extent doing this too. Japan, to some extent, was not shutting things down as quickly as other countries did. So the US is not the only one taking a laissez-faire approach. The UK was considering doing that until they actually looked at the models as to what the consequences were going to be, and then their own prime minister caught it. So now they're suddenly taking it a whole lot more seriously. So the UK will no longer be taking that laissez-faire approach, but it makes an enormous difference at what point you intervene. So if you look at cities in Italy, for instance, I can't remember one of the names. One of them was Bergamo. That's the one where everything was really the worst. The other one was nearby, started with an L, can't remember. But they locked down one day earlier than Bergamo, and they had a fraction of the number of cases. Because with exponential curves, it makes an enormous difference when you put these measures in place, whether you let it get out of hand before you try and lock down. So I've heard this called the hammer and the dance, and I can't remember where that comes from. Apologies to whoever came up with it. It wasn't me. But the idea is you lock everything down, and then you gradually reopen a little bit. If things start to spread, you lock it down again, and you try and open it up again, lock it down. So it's sort of on and off, on and off. So you're kind of dancing with the virus, trying not to just lock people down for a year and completely kill your economy, but to try and have enough social distancing to curtail the spread, but then try and get some economic activity going, and then back and forth, back and forth. And this could easily be 18 months of back and forth, easily. And there may be more waves as well beyond that. So it seems quite likely that this coronavirus is just going to become endemic in the human population. It's going to be one of those things that circulates, and every now and then there's an outbreak. And that's really quite unfortunate, because this is a very serious virus, and we don't know for sure about immunity if people have caught it. This seems to be a big unknown at the moment. Normally, when you've caught something, you become immune to it, and then you don't catch it again. You have natural immunity for the rest of your life. Some viruses don't seem to work that way. Some viruses, particularly dengue fever, I believe, and SARS as well, there was an issue with SARS, which of course is very similar to this one, where initial exposure can prime the immune system. And then when you have a subsequent exposure, the immune system, instead of saying, aha, we recognize this, let's kill it right away, there are some diseases where the antibody doesn't deactivate the virus. It actually facilitates the virus entering the cells of the immune system itself. And that's when you get a cytokine storm. So what we don't know at the moment is whether people who've already had it are safe, or whether they need to be even more protected than everybody else because they've already had one exposure, and a second exposure might be even worse. And this is a major factor because it also, of course, has tremendous impact on whether or not a vaccine would work. Because a vaccine would be your first exposure. That's what vaccines do. They generate antibodies to a particular condition, and that could have the same effect. So the reason that they're interested in this is partly because it's already demonstrated for dengue fever, but also because in an animal model for SARS, mice that had been vaccinated against SARS were more susceptible to SARS later than if they had never been vaccinated at all. So we don't know. It's not the same virus. It's similar. It's not the same. So I'm not saying that will happen with this virus, but we had absolutely better find out before we start vaccinating people, because you can come up with a vaccine, but if it's going to make people more susceptible rather than less, it's not going to help, obviously. And my concern is that they're likely to rush a vaccine without doing even the amount of testing they do on all the other ones, which I would already argue is insignificant or insufficient. But I would say that if they rush this one, then it would be a particular concern. They absolutely have to start looking into issues like priming the immune system for causing additional problems. And so I don't think the leaderships have necessarily really thought through a whole lot of these factors. And some of them are better at listening to scientists and medical professionals than others. In Germany, for instance, Angela Merkel is a chemist with a PhD. She seems to be taking a very scientific approach to all of this, and Germany has a lot less deaths, possibly as a result of that. But we shall have to see. We're looking at a giant experiment being run in real time as to what interventions work, what kind of medical versus non-pharmaceutical interventions end up being the best. And we honestly have no idea at this point. So it's an experiment and we wait the results.
I'm curious, right now in the States, many of us, are at home, and we've been at home for a couple weeks now, most of us. Some of us in some of the states are not yet asked to be home, but some of us are kind of getting used to being at home, and we're starting to reflect that, oh my gosh, the basics of life are being taken care of by a very small portion of the population right now. I mean, the number of people that are working to take care of the power grid and the internet and the hospitals and the medicals and the food, it doesn't really take that many people, actually not much that much labor, so to speak. And if we're going to get these checks, which we might or might not get, few $100s a week if we're on unemployment or whatever, or if we have income from whatever source, maybe this is a better way to live, almost. I mean, other than the virus and people getting hospitalized and intubated and whatnot. But after that, if that goes away, then maybe this is a better way to live, the way we're living right now. It's really local. It's kind of nice. We've got neighbors, I mean, if we each contributed maybe 10 hours a week to something that we could do, like help at the grocery store or help at the hospital or help with, driving something wherever it needs to be, maybe this is a better way. But that's really egalitarian, I guess. I don't know what the word would be.
The problem is that people aren't going to get paid.
Well,
and there's such a huge dependence on money.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't really take money to get food, though. You just need the food. You just need the people that are growing the food to continue growing it, and the people that are processing it to continue processing it, and the people that are moving it to continue moving it. You don't actually need money. You just need a way to motivate them one way or another. So,
and I actually think that will happen, but I think what we're likely to see is the national governments, particularly the large ones, they're not going to listen. They're too large. They operate beyond human scale. They have their own agendas that really have nothing to do with ordinary people whatsoever. And so I don't think anything at large scale is going to happen that would allow that sort of scenario to work. But if that large scale breaks down, which I would argue it absolutely will eventually, there won't be the money, there won't be the energy to project power at a distance. So I don't think that scenario, the scenario of national governments is going to be sustainable, and certainly not globalization. I think all the international and a fair few national governments are going to be beyond the trust horizon, and they're going to lose political legitimacy, and eventually they will wither away. They probably won't do it soon, especially if they have lots and lots of weaponry sitting there. They'll be going to try and take things away from other people before they give up and disappear. But I think when we get to the point when things are fundamentally more relocalized, we may well end up doing more of these sorts of things. But at the moment, there's this huge dependency on cash flow. And because people are living paycheck to paycheck, however pathological this system is, its demise would have instant consequences for so many people that you wouldn't sort of get a nice transition to something local. You would get revolution or civil war or something like that, because people would start to be starving. I mean, they would have no other choices, no recourse to resources whatsoever. And I think I mean, you and I can work from home. I've been working from home for years, and my partner can work from home as well. I mean, that's really not a problem. So our lives in some ways don't even look all that different at this point, because we're working from home now. We were working from home before. But I think for a lot of people, it will be very different. And there are lots of people who do have to go out into the world and do things. And I think at the moment, not everyone who is going to be proven to be essential is actually working. So I think some of the things that are going to prove to be essential, we didn't realize were essential in time. So I think there'll be lessons to learn from that. And perhaps some of the things that are being called essential really aren't. I can't think of a specific example at the moment, but I'd just be surprised if governments had got it exactly right as to who was essential and who was not instantly. I think there are likely to be mistakes, and that there are likely to be consequences from those mistakes. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting in this regard is a series of essays that Dmitry Orlov wrote years ago. And there was a series of 3 essays he wrote on comparing the USSR and the USA in terms of collapse readiness. So the USSR had already collapsed at that point. And so he was comparing what had happened, how they dealt with collapse, and then looking at the factors in the USA that were going to create risk around that. And one of his central points was, in Russia, you didn't have to worry about whether you were getting paid right away, because you didn't pay for your apartment or your utilities. You were simply told, you will live here, and it will be this temperature whether you like it or not. And things. So, and public transport was virtually free. So people had much less of a dependence on money there. So the economy kept going, even although people weren't being paid for months at a time. They turned up to work anyway, because they didn't have a dependence on money, and they didn't really have anything better to do. So the system kept going without the need for cash flow. This will not happen in the West. The cash flow dependency is huge. This is partly what I was lecturing about all those years, looking at the dependency on cash flow and what happens to an economy that is dependent on cash flow when you suddenly turn off the spigot, and how you immediately get pitched into a deflationary depression. The economy has a seizure. The money supply falls, the velocity of money falls off a cliff, and all of a sudden you end up in a situation where there's almost no money circulating in the economy. And then you can't connect producers and consumers, or buyers and sellers. So for instance, in New Zealand already, farmers are dumping milk because there's no market for it right now.
They're doing that in the US right now as well.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And this is what happened in the Depression as well. I mean, farmers were shooting their herds because they couldn't sell anything. They couldn't afford to feed them either. And they had no market for any of these things. So they were just disposing of things and cutting their losses, even although there were people who were starving down the road. So perverse things happen when you take the money out of the system, because it's the lubricant in the engine of the economy. And when your economy is trying to run without a lubricant, it is going to seize up on you. And that's exactly what we're in the beginning of right now. And one of the things that people say, one of the criticisms that people make of people like economists, and to some extent the administration in the US as well, is to say they're prioritizing the economy over human life. Now, they are, there's no question, because that is their focus. But they're not entirely wrong, because if you say, we'll just shut everything down for 18 solid months and there'll be no economic activity in that time to make sure that we've dealt with the virus, those economies will not come back, and without them, you don't feed 7.5 billion people or anything remotely close to that. So the problem is not just will some CEO get a bit less of a bonus? I mean, I don't care. I would rather they didn't get any bonus at all, obviously, but that's not an issue. The issue is, can the economy feed people? Can the economy continue to provide the basic services that keep people alive? And so, to that extent, the effects on absolutely killing the economy could actually cost more in terms of lives than the virus itself. So it's not a question of lives versus the economy. It's lives due to the virus versus lives due to the virus and the economic collapse. And how do you find the balance between controlling the virus and keeping enough economic activity going that you don't just have a massive revolution? And you can have this in an awful lot of places. I mean, I'm particularly concerned about the US because not only does it have much less access, expensive, but you've also got this enormous amount of weaponry. So people have been panic buying guns and ammo. And it's just, it beggars belief to the thought of what they're going to do with this. But once you've got all that weaponry and then people are angry and they don't have the essentials, it doesn't take much extrapolation to think that that could go somewhere pretty unpleasant pretty quickly. The US is not the only one. For instance, in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro has been saying, oh, I'm athletic, there's nothing to worry about. Brazilians need to get out there and just live their lives, and Brazilians are super healthy, we never get sick, so we'll be fine. So this is the ultimate in laissez-faire. It's even more so than the Trump administration. I absolutely think there's going to be a revolution in Brazil at some point. Bolsonaro has already got it himself anyway, so we'll just have to see whether illness among his social circle changes his mind. But I think his people might run out of patience before his mind changes. And there may be political problems in other countries as well. Not everywhere trusts their leadership. And this is one aspect of the scenario that I was talking about in 2013 was the collapse of the trust horizon. And that's absolutely what we're seeing. So particularly in the US, this has been going on for a long time. I mean, certainly for the entirety of the Trump administration, it had started before that. But what's been happening in the last 3 years is an absolute deliberate acceleration of trust destruction. And so now you've got a scenario where you've got hospitals and states and the federal government bidding against each other, and nobody knows where the equipment is or where it's going or who's paying what and how any of this is being organized. So when you take the trust out of the system and you don't have people working together anymore, what you get is just a shit show. Excuse my language, but that's what's going on in the US at the moment. There is no coordination because there's no trust. In other places, there's a lot more trust, so people are going along with things. I mean, here, for instance, not everyone is going along with the lockdown, but most people are. Because it's been presented to them not in an authoritarian kind of way, not in a you will do this or we're going to punish you, but in a we really need to do this for the benefit of everyone. This is why, this is what's happened, this is where this would go if we don't do anything. So we're going to do this. Please follow these instructions. And if you follow them, then we won't have to go around and actually try and enforce anything. And the government has said, we'll be here to answer your questions. Phone in, we'll do regular sort of updates on everything. And it's working really well because the trust is there. It makes an enormous difference when there's trust and when there isn't. I find at the international level, trust is really broken down as well. And again, the Trump administration has had a lot to do with that because it's been doing things like stealing deliveries of personal protective equipment that have been destined for other countries and ordering multinational companies that normally supply many markets to only supply the US, even when they're critical suppliers of these things in other countries. So it's basically saying to countries that are allies of the US, we don't care if your healthcare workers die. because we only care about our healthcare workers. To the extent that they even care about them, I'm not convinced that there's anywhere near enough care about the healthcare workers, even in America, at the level of the administration, because these people are not getting the equipment that they need. They are being put at risk. The sacrifices these people are being asked to make for themselves, for their families, it's horrific, and they are not being supported in the way that they should be. So when you've taken this trust out, and you've got sort of every man for himself, and it's a dog eat dog situation, things happen that should not ever happen, that didn't need to happen. If you cooperate, things work reasonably well. You may not have everyone have everything they need, but if people all feel they're all in the same boat, we're all in this together, we'll all make sacrifices, then they don't mind so much. They don't feel that they're the only ones being forced to sacrifice something. Sorry about this. When I talk too much, sometimes my throat gets dry. I might have to go and just grab a glass of water if we can wait.
Oh, that's fine. Go ahead. Yeah, whatever
I
you
will
need
be
to
right
do.
back.
Sure.
Right back.
Recently, I have been hearing from a few friends, a small, very small number of friends, various ideas about other things going on that are not apparent to anybody that's paying attention, even to the non-mainstream media. And I'm wondering if you've heard of any things, and if you give them any mind or not.
Well, I follow quite a lot of medical information, so some of it gets a bit technical. So there are issues about how to treat people and things that I don't think are necessarily shared as widely as they should be. I'm particularly thinking in terms of when you're ventilating people, what kind of pressures you use. The traditional methods for ventilating people with relatively high pressure seem to actually aggravate the inflammation in the lungs. So there's a whole lot of debate at the moment around what kind of pressures you should use and how you should try and reoxygenate people. And so I'm finding that the medical stuff is really fascinating to me, because that was my original background. But in terms of more general things, I think people in general are really not aware of the scale of the impact worldwide, because things are happening so quickly that people don't realize that the world has completely changed in the last month or so, that there are going to be things that never come back, that there's going to be a new normal. And we don't yet know what it is, because this is such a black swan. To cause all this to happen so quickly, there are very few things that would have caused things to unravel as quickly as this. There are very few things that would have caused this level of global shutdown. So I think people are just somewhat lagging behind in their understanding of what the impact is going to be. Most people, I think, are expecting to get back to normal and just go back to, life will go back to the way it was, and there'll be the same range of economic activity and the same range of opportunities and things for people. And I think that's really not the case, unfortunately. And in some ways, as nice as and comfort-wise and things as our previous lifestyle was for a lot of people, at the same time, it was so unsustainable. We were approaching limits in resource terms. We were already at the top of a bubble before this virus came. There were so many risk factors already in terms of limits to growth that this was going to happen anyway, virus or no virus. But because of the virus, it's happening so fast. And I think it's going to feel like, for people, like the rug has been pulled out from under their feet, that every assumption they built their lives on has just been invalidated in the space of about a month. And there's going to be a whole lot of adjustment that's going to have to go on as to how people are going to work out what the new normal is going to be. And I think it's going to look different in different places. So one of the issues that I've lectured on for a long time is that when you start to break down globalization, you lose the homogenizing effect of trade. So if you can trade, you can specialize in particular areas. You can offshore all sorts of things, even essentials, and as long as the system keeps going, you don't have shortages. But as soon as you get something like this happening, which is breaking down globalization in real time, all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, 97% of our antibiotics come from China. Whoops. and things like that. So there's going to be an enormous move towards national self-sufficiency again. Going back to the era before globalization, countries are going to say, there's no way we can outsource this essential production. This has to happen here, or we have no control over it. We have no control over the supply chains. And for decades, nobody has cared that they had no control over the supply chains because there wasn't an enormous problem. But now there is an enormous problem. All the vulnerabilities of this brittle, totally unresilient system are being exposed all at once. So there are a whole lot of things that are going to end up crashing as a result. And we're going to have to figure out how we get to that new normal, which is going to look like national self-sufficiency eventually. But getting there from here is not going to be simple because it's going to be capital intensive. If we're going to bring factories back and then hire workers who can't work for the kind of wages that people have been paying in other countries, but the places that have been the sweatshops of the world, they offshored production for an arbitrage in global wages. But if you relocalize everything, all of that is not going to work anymore. Unless, of course, the host systems have collapsed to the extent that you can treat the people in your own host country as sweatshop workers as well, which could happen. That could be the new normal, hopefully not. Hopefully we can build something that looks more like national self-sufficiency without actually turning it into an oligarchy or something like that, an autocratic oligarchy. But my worry is that is exactly where certain countries are going, because you're getting such a consolidation of power at the top, and you're just getting everyone who used to be middle class shoved down into a sort of giant proletariat, if you like. And this is what happened in Argentina. We're looking for a small scale example. Argentina in 2001, their banking system collapsed and it basically beggared the middle class, and you ended up with an extremely rich few people at the top, and everybody else was living in shanty towns and things, which they don't necessarily do that now, but that was the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. They managed to recover because the whole world hadn't gone the same way at the same time. So there were other healthy economies they were able to rebuild from. But if you look at the Argentine example, and now you imagine, what if there isn't a functioning global economy to feed off to rebuild your own economy, and you have to rebuild it from scratch by yourself with the resources, people and other resources you have in your own country? That's going to take time, and it's going to cost money at a time when capital is going to be very scarce. So I don't think we're going to be building massive, sophisticated factories. I think we're going to be perhaps building cottage industries to start with. And I think thinking through what kind of cottage industries would be possible and would be viable would be a wonderful kind of initiative to take, because that's really where it's got to start. This kind of rebuilding is going to have to start from the bottom up. So initially it's going to be quite small scale, and then we'll see what can scale up. But in the meantime, I mean, where do they make shoes? I mean, or any other essential kind of thing, really basic things. If the only place you can get these is from another country on the other side of the world, eventually we're going to have a problem. So I think we're going to need to look at investing in skills, investing in setting up cottage industries as decentralized as possible. And they'll be small scale inherently, but also if you have decentralized cottage industries, it's not capital intensive, it's not energy intensive. You can often do it with a fair amount of labor and a small amount of equipment. And you're going to be looking at local supply chains, local distribution networks and things for quite a long time. So things are going to look different depending on where you are. So your local reality will be your total reality at some point. This is one of the things I've been lecturing about, that we can't assume that we're going to even out our disparities of resource access and things through trade, because we're probably not, at least for quite a few years. So we're going to have to say, what do we have where we live? What skills, what resources of all kinds, and what can we do with those? And I think it's going to be a pretty bare bones economy for quite a long time, until we really start to build something up. And it's going to be an economic depression, very much the way I was discussing before. And an economic depression is a perfect storm in financial terms. I mean, you have unemployment goes through the roof, entitlements and benefits and salaries are cut. And people end up losing homes to foreclosure. Their savings disappear in banking crises. So their investments disappear in a stock market crash. And you really have a massive reset. So people are going to be starting with a lot less in terms of resources, and what they're then capable of building up is going to depend on what kind of seed capital people manage to extract from the system before it was too late. And who knows what that will be or how it will be distributed. So it's going to look totally different in different places, depending on what seed capital there is, what other kind of resources, what kind of climate. There's so many factors that are going to make different places look very different from each other, much more so than they have done for a very long time. So there's no such thing as a short answer.
Well, that's all right. No, one of the things I've been wondering about is that, well, there's this whole technological idea that technology and the internet has advanced to such a great degree that we're getting to a point where we're almost on the verge of kind of all coming into harmony with each other and all kind of about ready to pull in the same direction. And I've heard this called the singularity, or the kind of like the conscious Gaia theory, or
I would call that life at the top of the bubble.
yes. But I think the idea,
unfortunately, there's nowhere to go but down from there.
I think the idea is that with the internet connecting us all, that we're kind of becoming tuned in to what reality is all at the same time. Well, not all at the same time, but we're all kind of becoming attuned to it. And that there is technically enough food for everybody. There's enough energy for everybody. And we actually have a lot of excess energy and labor that we could put to use doing something else. We could have a really egalitarian world if there was leadership, or just even a spirit of, yes, this is true, we could do it this way. We could just totally change gears and we could just all live in a more sustainable, equal way. But that doesn't necessarily support millionaires or billionaires or capitalists. And in a lot of these scenarios, like you've been talking about, in the scenario you have been talking about, a localized economy, what is the place for the billionaire or the millionaire in that?
There isn't one. And I think
So is
what
this a
they're
threat to them then, everything that's going on? And if so, what is their response going to be? Or what are they already doing?
Well, what ends up happening when you move from the top of the bubble into contraction is the financial value of physical assets falls off a cliff. The value of financial assets will disappear almost entirely, but even the financial value of physical assets will fall. People are going to be forced to sell whatever they can in order to get the money they need to buy the absolute essentials. The people who still have liquidity, have preserved capital as liquidity, are going to buy up everyone else's assets for pennies on the dollar. And so you're going to get a massive increase in inequality to start with. But then they're going to go and build themselves green zones with nice big fences and security guards and things to enjoy the wealth. But what they'll have built themselves are gilded prisons, because you can't live that way surrounded by masses, millions and millions of incredibly angry people who've just lost everything. Somebody is going to bribe the security guard to leave the door open, and then that will be it. So yes, they benefit a lot initially, and they're going to think, wow, we're like the kings of old, and then the pitchforks will come out, and they're not going to do very well in that scenario. There are not that many of them, and there's a limit to what they'll be able to give the people who they pay to defend them. Because often they don't tend to treat the people who serve them in very nice ways. I mean, there was a really interesting article a while back, I think it might have been about a year. This tech guy had been called to talk to a bunch of billionaires about how to manage security in a meltdown and things like that. And he was saying, well, the first thing you would do is treat your security guards and people like that as members of your own family, because then that's why they would be loyal to you, because you're loyal to them. And they were talking about instead ways to pay them as little as possible, get as much work out of them as possible, keep them at a distance and things like that. And this guy was just thinking, no, if you do that, you are so screwed,
Where did you
because
see
these people
this?
will not be loyal. I'll see if I can find it. It was about a year ago. It might have been in Wired. I'm not sure, but it was a tech guy whose name I hadn't heard of, but apparently is reasonably well known. So I will see if I can find it, because it really was eye-opening. And I think it really illustrates the way that a lot of people with a huge amount of money view the rest of us. It's almost like ordinary people are parasites who are trying to get hold of pieces of what they have. And it's like everybody's sort of grubbing away trying to get what they, and the way they tend to look at people is to treat them as a threat. And that's absolutely not the way to treat people if you want them to be loyal to you or to help you in any way. So I think that's going to be a huge problem. And basically what's happening is we're sliding into the psychology of contraction. And as much as I love the idea of a wonderful cooperative, connected world where we all work together, and absolutely, if we did this, we could achieve better outcomes than any other way of doing it. But that doesn't mean that we'll do it just because it would be the best decision.
Sure.
Unfortunately, that's more of a reflection of the psychology of expansion. It's not even quite that, because during expansion, it's not just that we're getting nicer to each other, although in general we do. I mean, you end up with less nuclear tests, less wars, less conflict, more democracy and things on the way up, more freedom. And so you get a lot of positive things on the way up. But at the same time, you don't necessarily get a whole lot of kumbaya. I mean, you can. We did in the 60s, for instance, to a point, among some people. But what you tend to get in a contraction is this sort of dog eat dog kind of thing. The trust horizon collapses, then you don't end up with any kind of coordination, because all the larger scale things, both public and private, they lose trust, they lose legitimacy, they contract, they collapse, they lay people off. And you end up with a whole lot of things going wrong at once. And when the pie is shrinking, human beings tend to fight like cats in a sack. So you can't really think that we're going to have this marvelous cooperative future, not at a global scale. And we can do things like that more locally, provided we're not surrounded by people who think differently, for instance, more aggressively, perhaps, because it's wonderful to be a nice sort of group of hippies working the land. I would love that. But if they're surrounded by warring tribes, it's not going to last very long. So it really depends on the context as to what's possible. And I think the places that are somewhat more remote are probably going to be better off in some ways, because they're going to have a bit more freedom to do things differently. If you're in an area that functions at a larger scale, it's much more difficult to be independent of the powers that be. So they tend to be able to play whack-a-mole with whatever you're trying to do, if it's not in their interests, and it usually won't be. If you're trying to decentralize and create a local economy that doesn't just funnel money up to the top, then you are a threat to the powers that be, and the powers that be will play whack-a-mole with decentralization initiatives. But if you're a little bit further away and you can be doing things kind of under the radar, then you might be able to get it up to a critical mass where it can take off and prove its worth before someone has a chance to wreck it on you. And it helps very much to be somewhere that functions at a human scale. I mean, you live in a small town. So I think small towns have a lot to offer. And one of my last video series, I did a decision tree thing where I was looking at what are your different options. You could be rural, you could be urban, you could be small town, you could be eco-villages, all these different things. And I went through all the advantages and disadvantages of different options for different people, because there's no one right answer as to where you should be and what you should be doing. But my personal thought is small towns with a reasonably cohesive kind of mindset are probably going to be able to come together, work at human scale, and do things like set up cottage industries. But they won't be generating the kind of economic activity that supports people at their previous level. So we're all going to have to take a step down in terms of what we consider acceptable from a material wealth standpoint, but we can rediscover all the human connection that we lost in the process. So it's not all a bad thing. I mean, yes, we will have less material wealth. Yes, we will have fewer opportunities. Anything that would have cost money, a lot of money, or taken a huge amount of energy, we probably won't be doing. But we can do a lot that will make us actually a lot happier than we were in our disconnected, atomized rat race world. I mean, that's what we were used to. But we look at what we gained from doing that, all the stuff that we have around us. We don't tend to look at what we lost. We don't tend to look at how we lost the connection, how we lost community and neighborhoods the way they used to be and the way they used to support each other. And I think that that's a huge oversight to not realize that we actually had something very special that was completely non-economic, but it was very special and it was a huge part of our life support systems. And we gave that up in exchange for having cheap stuff. And now we have an opportunity to go in the other direction. But unfortunately, it's going to be discontinuous. So on the way up, it's fairly smooth. On the way down, it's like a lightning bolt. And so that's going to be very uncomfortable for an awful lot of people. The problem will be getting from to there from here, because it isn't going to be a smooth path at all. And there's going to be a whole lot of people at higher levels of authority who are going to want to stay there, but they're not going to be able to. They're going to cling to power and try and repress people in an attempt to maintain their power, but ultimately it won't work. So I think we're looking at several decades of really quite a lot of upheaval before we stabilize on some kind of new normal. I mean, it doesn't take human beings all that long to sort of establish a new normal. I mean, if you look back at, if you look at what's happening now in the US with the Trump administration, and you told people in 2016, which was only 4 years ago, you tell them, well, this is going to happen, they would be horrified. But now it's just, well, this is the new normal. So people are kind of getting used to it. People will get used to other things as well, and then they'll forget what we had before or what circumstances we were living under before. But it will take a while. So I don't think we'll have any lasting stability for a long time, but we may have long enough periods for people to kind of relax a little bit and say this is some kind of new normal, even if it isn't necessarily going to last that long before there's some other upheaval that comes along and knocks people over. But we shall see. I don't think you and I will end up living long enough to see the other side of it. Not because I'm suggesting we're going to die early, but even if we live our entire natural lifespan, I don't think we're going to see the other side of it. The last time there was a bubble that burst, a really major bubble, was 1720. And it culminated towards the end of the 1700s in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, a whole lot of things that happened towards the very end of it. So darkness before the dawn, if you like. And then things took off in the 1800s. So I think this is a bigger bubble. Chances are it will take at least that long. But I'm not really speculating beyond that as to how long it would take. I'm not even going to be here. And there are so many things that are going to happen that I couldn't possibly predict over that kind of time span that I can't really hazard that much of a guess as to what the new normal might look like and how many people it might have. But I don't think we're going to have any degree of globalization. I think it's going to be much, much more local and at a much smaller scale, much simpler. I think complexity, we've had this hyper complexity develop, especially over the last few decades. And that all really depends on the available energy to a society, the EREI of the major energy sources of a society. And those are going to be falling even further than they already have. We're not going to be able to maintain the complexity we currently have. We're going to end up trying to scrounge around and see what we can make out of what we have. And John Michael Greer has written some interesting things about this on the salvage society and things. And I think that will definitely be part of the new normal when we get there. But a whole lot of upheaval in the meantime.
Well, Nicole, I would like to thank you so much for being on the call with us. I have found this really
No
interesting.
problem. Anytime.
And especially, you know, the insight that you have as you reflect back on where your thinking was at, you know, 7, 8, 9 years ago, and how that has changed, and kind of more of your reflections on what is actually going on right now and what it's like to be in this time of change and transition, as we might call it, or the time of the coronavirus, whatever you want to say.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy to chat anytime.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole.
You're welcome.